Our story begins far out in the North Atlantic Ocean off Canada. There is an island there called Newfoundland. Along its northeastern coast, between Musgrave Harbour and Deadman's Bay, there is a stretch of shoreline known as Shalloway. It is a rough stretch of coast. The Atlantic does not approach that shore gently. Waves roll in long and steady, breaking against the steep sand. Even when the weather seems calm, the movement of the sea never fully stops. The wind is almost always present. It carries salt and mist inland from the ocean. Trees near the shoreline do not grow the same as they do farther inland. They lean away from the sea, shaped over time by weather that arrives without much warning. There is no harbor there, only open coastline, and a deep beach facing the Atlantic. At the far end of that beach runs Shalloway Brook. It comes down from the Barrens, crosses the sand, and enters the ocean. Around that brook, the land changes slightly, and the ground rises. Thicker woods grow there, offering some shelter from the wind. For a long time, people traveling that coast noticed something about that place. Something did not feel right. Long before roads connected those communities, people traveled that coastline on foot. They moved between settlements for work, supplies, and family, sometimes taking most of a day to reach the next place. Because of that, small cabins were built along the routes. They were simple shelters, places where travelers could warm themselves, rest, and spend the night. One of those cabins stood near Shalloway Brook. For years, it was used by people moving along the coast. Over time, stories began to circulate about that place. Travelers spoke of being bothered there. Not always in the same way, but often enough that it was mentioned. Some described hearing movement in the woods nearby, while others spoke of sounds that were difficult to place. And some they spoke of seeing a light. They said it looked like a lantern, moving through the trees at night. It would appear at a distance, moving slowly, as though someone was making their way toward the cabin, but it never seemed to arrive. The light would drift between the trees, then disappear before reaching the clearing. Some believed a man might be living somewhere nearby, or even in the cabin itself. A hermit, perhaps. Others said a pirate lived there, guarding his treasure. No one could say for certain, but the stories persisted, and so did the harassment. People approaching that cabin were aware of the stories, and some have experienced the disturbances themselves. Until one evening, two travelers reached the cabin after a long day walking along the coast. They went inside, lit the stove, and settled in. A lantern was placed on the table. As the room warmed, they passed the time the way many travelers did. They played cards, and for a while nothing disturbed them. Then there was a knock at the door. Not a loud knock, just enough to be heard. One of the men stood, thinking it might be another traveler looking for shelter. He opened the door. Moonlight lay across the ground outside, but no one was there. He stood for a moment, listening, then closed the door and returned to the table. They continued their game, and some time passed. Then something lightly struck the roof. It was a sharp, hollow noise, like a small stone hitting the roof and rolling down. The men looked at each other. Then a moment later, another stone struck the side of the cabin. The interruption was now harder to dismiss. There was another knock at the door, and one of the men went to the door again and opened it. He looked out into the clearing and toward the trees in the path. Again, there was no one there. No strange sounds, and no one visible. Just the sound of the nearby surf. He closed the door. This time, neither of them returned to the cards. They spoke together quietly. Someone was outside. Whether it was a stranger or something else, the harassment had become deliberate. And because of the stories they've heard, they were afraid. They decided they would not wait to be spooked again. They both stood by the door and listened. The lantern burned on the table behind them. The logs in the stove were crackling in the silence. Only their breath, the wind and the waves were heard. Minutes passed. Then the knock came again. This time, they swung the door open immediately, and both men spelled out at once and split apart, each moving around opposite sides of the cabin. Whoever had been at the door would not get away unseen this time. In the darkness beyond the cabin, they encountered the man. What followed happened quickly. There was confusion, voices were raised, a struggle in the dark, and when it was over, the old man was dead. Some say victim to his own sword, and was beheaded. For a time, neither of the travelers spoke. The wind moved through the trees. The sound of the surf carried on in the distance. Only a short time earlier, they had been inside sitting by the stove, but now they stood outside, looking down at what had happened. There was no one nearby, and hours to the next town, no one would arrive before morning. They were alone with their dead tormentor. They decided that before daylight, they would bury him. The ground near the brook was softer. Working by lantern light, they chose a place and began to dig. It was slow, grueling work, because they had little in the way of tools. But the ground gave way little by little. When it was deep enough, they placed him in the earth and covered him. By the time they finished, the first light of morning had begun to appear, and they returned to the cabin, but did not sleep. In daylight, the place appeared much as it had before. The brook continued to flow toward the sea. The trees rustled in the wind. The land was unchanged. Only the disturbed ground near the brook marked what had taken place. The two men gathered their belongings and continued on their way, outwardly as if nothing happened, but inwardly now tormented by the event more than the harassment. For a time, the story remained with them, but as most stories do, the truth gets out at some time, and the visitor became known as Old Man Shalloway. Our story did not end there. In the years that followed, people continued to speak about the place called Shalloway, about the woods, about the feeling of being watched, and about the light, a single light, seen at different times, in different conditions. But much like the years leading up to our story, sometimes in the trees, sometimes across open bog, sometimes along the shoreline, sometimes it was described as a lantern, while other times something less defined. It's been seen moving at a distance, but never approaching directly. There are stories of it keeping pace with travelers, moving alongside the road or across the land, as though following, but never closing the gap, never rushing in, never quite arriving. These reports have continued over time, through different years, and from different people. Mind you, not everyone who passed through the area saw anything unusual, but enough people did that the story remains even today. The cabin is no longer there, and its exact location is uncertain. The burial place is not known, but the brook remains, and the story remains with it. Even now, people still speak of Old Man Shalloway, and from time to time, there are still reports of a light being seen there, moving across the land at a distance, keeping pace, but never quite reaching you.